Hi, I'm Dr. Corey Miller, President and CEO of Ratio Christi Campus Apologetics Alliance. We are on 150 different college campuses. We have a professor's ministry, a high school ministry, and of course, we go after the university students to glorify Christ in the universities. In this episode of Thoughtful Christianity, we're looking at a topic that is very intriguing: women, religion, and law, a comparative exploration. And my guest with me on this episode is Laurie Stewart. Laurie is an attorney, a mediator, a law school professor, and a Christian apologist. She has a Juris Doctor degree from Chapman University Law and an MA in Christian Apologetics from Talbot School of Theology, Biola University, my alma mater as well. She's trained in conflict coaching, mediation, and arbitration. As a lawyer, she served on the Iowa Supreme Court Family Law Task Force. As a trial attorney, she's had plaintiffs and defendants in a variety of civil matters, including defending religious liberty and traditional family values, both concerns in what we're going to be talking about. She served as the past president of Women in Apologetics. She's a frequent speaker in churches, at conferences, on universities, and various seminars and women's groups. And together with her husband, they travel the world basically and talk on things that are related to law, Christian apologetics, and a host of varieties on family. She served on the board of the Orange County chapter of the Federalist Society, the Orange County Women Lawyers and Marketplace Women of Orange County, and is currently on the board of Ratio Christi. She wrote her master's thesis, which is the topic of today's discussion, on a cross-cultural analysis of women, religion, and law. She's a self-proclaimed liberal feminist of the past, but still a feminist in certain biblical rights. Welcome to the program, Laurie.
Thanks, Corey. I actually no longer use that word feminist to describe myself. Definitely former feminist.
First wave, second wave, third, fourth, fifth wave.
It's a loaded term, and is kind of, if you want to talk about women's rights, okay, we can have that conversation. I'm all about that. Better treatment of women. But if you start using the feminist, it's such a loaded term these days. I avoid it altogether.
All right. Well, I love the approach. It was an enjoyment reading through your master's thesis. I need to go through it a second and third time to be able to absorb it better, but I really loved the approach. My own dissertation, which I just got a book published on, In Search of the Good Life Through the Eyes of Aristotle, Maimonides, and Aquinas, deals with the comparative approach too. And I just thoroughly love that approach because I feel like sometimes it helps to bring out certain salient points that are otherwise omitted when just focusing on a solitary issue or person or thought. Would you agree with that?
I agree. And I think it actually helps us to be better thinkers. If we are able to compare different views on any particular topic, I think it's going to help us to be able to understand what we believe and why we believe it. We're just more thoughtful in our own opinions.
Right, right. And how was it that you arrived at this topic? I mean, we can see your background interests, but why this topic in particular? What was it that drove you to it?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of a few things. First, graduating with my master's in Christian apologetics, I wanted to do a thesis. I didn't have to do one, but I wanted to do one. In case I want to go on and pursue a PhD someday, it's nice to have that under your belt. Plus, I really love research and writing. That's what I teach in law school, is legal research and writing. So I love that aspect. So I thought this is an opportunity for me to use my gifts, experience, and to be able to write something maybe new. And so when I did some research on this topic of women, religion, the law, there was very, very little, if anything, on this particular source. Now, having said that, I just found out that there was a journal that will be coming out. I think that it might be addressing some of this. I'm trying to get my hands on a copy right now. But at the time that I wrote this, back in 2019, there was really nothing concrete on this subject. So as a lawyer, I decided to take a juridical approach, and that is examining the law of different countries. And I chose these countries because of their four very different fundamental worldviews, i.e. religion, to be able to look at how the laws treat women in particular, because we all can look on the news and see that we have a problem with discrimination and violence against women, not just here in America, but all over the world. It looks different, I think, depending on where you live, the geography, but there's just a problem. You can't help but to notice the rise of the Me Too movement, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's just a prime example of this global outcry of trying to find a way to have the conversation. And unfortunately, the feminist approach, especially modern day feminism, claims to have some kind of answers for the problem of discrimination and
Hmm.
violence against women, but without really properly understanding, I say, giving it a proper and accurate diagnosis of the problem, we're not really going to find an effective solution to the problem. And so that's what my paper endeavors to do. One, give an apologetic for why Christianity does not actually oppress women,
Mm-hmm.
although maybe some Christians have
Good
oppressed
point.
women in the
Yep, that's
past,
right.
and we have to admit that. But Christianity itself does not oppress women, and I think it actually offers the best hope for the better treatment of women.
Yeah, okay. And so you actually couch your juridical approach then in the backdrop of human rights, which is common parlance in women's rights considerations, right? Women's
Yes,
rights is a matter of human rights so that it
yes,
falls under that universal scope. Women are human
yes,
too.
yes.
But what does that mean? Why is it an important place for us to begin the discussion that women's rights are human rights? And maybe talk to
Yeah, I
us a
think
little
that
bit about that universal declaration that was made.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Talking about women's rights is not really a new issue, but if we're going to have some kind of framework for having an intelligent
Hmm.
conversation about it, I think it helps to be able to think about it in terms of human rights, because human rights, we can, at least in more recent history, take a look at what happened with the United Nations forming after World War II Nazi Germany. It formed because the nations wanted to come together and say, we don't want this to happen anymore. This was an atrocity. The Holocaust, what happened in World War II, Nazi Germany, this was awful. We don't want, well, let's understand what happened so that we can avoid this. And so out of the United Nations, especially the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, we see this idea that human rights are important for everyone. It's
Hmm.
something that we're born with, and that there is a higher law that is above man-made law. Now, why is that important? Well, if you take a look at the Nuremberg trial, uh, one of the defenses that many of the Nazi soldiers were using as they were accused of committing terrible atrocities is they said we were following the law, that the law in our country,
Right.
which was a good argument. But unless you look at, there's a law that is above the law, and that is a higher law, that is God's law or divine law or an objective moral law that is outside of ourselves. So I decided to use the framework that was established by the United Nations originally. That's not to say that we follow it necessarily, that the UN is necessarily following it that closely anymore today. But at its founding, it was really looking at human rights from the perspective of universality. The human rights are universal,
Uh huh.
that they're inherent, the inherency. It's inherent in all of us. It's something we're born with. We don't earn it. We don't deserve it. And that there is a higher law that we answer to. So I use that as kind of the framework, really then focusing on that third aspect, the higher law. What is the law that we are going to follow if we're going to try to identify human rights, and specifically for my
Yeah.
paper, women's rights?
Yeah. We used to have a lot of buzz around the idea that you can't legislate morality, right? Uh, when you
I
think
used
of
to
it,
use that.
you
I
did.
used to use that when I was a feminist and pro-choice. I use that. I say we can't legislate morality,
My
but you
body,
and I
my
know
choice.
we legislate morality all the time.
Yeah,
Every law has some moral basis to
every
it.
law is someone's conception of the good, so that when
Yes,
someone legislates, it's not that it comes from a vacuum. There's a set of assumptions, there's a worldview, there's a value system that people bring to the table when they are legislating for the public good, and that's what it is.
that's
uh,
right.
and it's interesting, even with that 1948 declaration, the one of the senior architects in that product was Charles Malik. And Charles Malik, of course, was trained at Harvard as a philosopher, as a Christian philosopher. I think he was Eastern Orthodox, but he came to that project with that set of assumptions, just like in the United States Declaration of Independence and our founding documents. If you've got a social contract out there, even if it's not, representative exactly from maybe a predominant religion in the neighborhood, there are clues, there are traces. It's inescapable because legislation doesn't happen in a vacuum. So here we go then. We enter into this comparative approach, and you select four what I think are good examples. And they are samples. They're good sample sizes for representative worldviews on how laws represent certain views and whether those laws and thus those views are the best thing for women's rights or not. And so you begin looking at Saudi Arabia, and you look at Islam and law. So unpack that for us a little bit. So the people who are listening, we understand, we get it. This is limited. We're looking at Saudi Arabia. There are other Islamic countries. But first of all, why is Saudi Arabia an important sample to represent for Islam here?
Yeah. So if you don't mind, Corey, I'd like to kind of just back up a minute
Sure.
to give a little bit more context for your audience. So what I did is examine specific laws as they relate to the treatment of women in the area of what I call family matters and then bodily integrity. So what does that mean? I looked at laws as they relate maybe to marriage, child marriage. I looked at laws as they relate to rape, female genital mutilation, domestic violence, just to give you a few ideas. And I was pretty consistent with the categories that I analyzed in those laws for 4 different countries. So the 4 countries that I chose were taking a look at Islam as an ideology or worldview and its impact on laws as we see in Saudi Arabia. So I looked at the laws in Saudi Arabia as they pertain to women, specifically, discrimination and violence. By the way, I because I was so limited in time, and my thesis still was twice as long as it was supposed to be, I purposely excluded any discussion about economic arguments and property rights and voting. So that's not included in my paper. So I'm hoping someone will pick up on this research topic and go further with it. But nevertheless, so I chose 4 countries, starting with looking at Islam and Saudi Arabia. I looked at Hinduism and its impact on laws in India, because it's a very pluralistic society. It's a good example of that. And then I looked at atheism as a worldview, a religion, if you will, but a worldview. And so I looked at China, which is considered by many to be the most atheistic country in the world. And then I looked at U.S. and the Christian influence at the founding of our government. So I just want to give some context to the audience as we launch into this conversation then about Saudi Arabia. So why did I choose to look at the laws of Saudi Arabia and examining how Islam in particular as a worldview would impact discrimination and violence against women? Well, the answer is because, first of all, we have two of the holy sites, Mecca and Medina, that are in Saudi Arabia. But also many, not all, it's arguable, but many would view Saudi Arabia to be kind of the purest form of Islam. They definitely have a government that is based in Islamic law, Sharia law, and so it heavily influences their laws. All their laws, the courts, even the royal decrees that are made by the royal family, the king, everything has to conform to, for example, the Quran. So it has to conform to their holy documents, which is part of what Sharia law is based on. So that's why I decided to choose Saudi Arabia.
Okay, yeah, and Saudi Arabia represents the Sunni faction, which is not a small faction, right? You have the Shiites and the Sunnis. The Sunnis are 90% of Muslims around the world, so it is a good representation for sure. How do the laws then that you examined represent Islam fairly accurately? These laws aren't taking place again in a vacuum, but they are very interesting comparing them to the U.S. or other places with respect to that window that you looked at with women's rights. So what kinds of laws did you look at that were what maybe concerning and rooted within Islam itself.
Yeah. So with each of the four worldviews and the countries, what I start with each section is a background of the country. Just is, of course, a very brief overview of the background. So it's going to be oversimplified and overgeneralized, but just for the sake of time. So I looked at the history and the impact and the structure of laws. How do we even get laws, for example, in a country like Saudi Arabia? And then to look and see how, for example, the worldview would impact its view, for example, on women. So we talk about, well, let me just discuss first some what the Quran even says about women. I'll just give some quick examples here. I have actually my notes out in front of me. But from the Quran, we actually see that it approves of Muslim husbands beating their wives, women inheriting less than men. A woman's testimony is half as valuable as a man's. Husbands have authority over their wives. They're actually possessions of their husbands. Men can marry up to 4 wives, but women only marry 1 husband. And men can take sex slaves that are outside of marriage. Now, it doesn't mean that all Muslims are practicing these things. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that at all. But this is what the Quran actually teaches. And you can look at my thesis and get all of the exact sources from the Quran. I cite to their own book themselves. By the way, it is the copy of the Quran that my husband and I have, we actually got from one of Saudi Arabia's institutions. So it's kind of interesting. So we use their own book. It was not something I pulled off that is a very random translation or something. So I cite to that in my thesis. So taking a look at the laws, for example, in the Sharia court, first of all, your judges in the Sharia courts must be Muslim and they must be male. So women can't even be judges in Saudi Arabia if they're following Sharia law. They also don't have something that we have in the U.S., which is precedent. We follow precedent to help us look at past case law to inform our decisions going forward. We even have binding precedent depending on your jurisdiction. So, for example, if we have laws here in California where I'm located, if a lower court it has a case, it must follow, it is mandatory, binding, it must follow any case decisions that are made by courts above it, like the Court of Appeals or even the California Supreme Court, and of course the United States Supreme Court, that they are beholden, they must follow, it's mandatory, binding. We don't see that in Sharia law at all. There's no binding precedent, which means you can only imagine there's not necessarily a precedent or a predictability as to how a judge might decide a case. So it can be, and we do see laws applied very arbitrarily. And so that's not fair, anyone, in the process. But if you're going to take a look, for example, at divorce laws in Saudi Arabia based on Sharia law, a man can divorce very easily, but a woman to get a divorce has to go to court and she has to get the permission of her husband. So imagine that a woman is suffering from some kind of domestic abuse at the hands of her husband. She has to take her abuser to court and get his permission to get divorced. I mean,
not likely going to happen.
Not likely at all. So those are just a few examples from my thesis.
Yeah, and I we could wax eloquent on that much more. I would encourage people to pick up your thesis. Where can they get a copy of that?
You can just go online and Google Laurie Stewart Blogspot. That's my blog. I call it Women of Intelligent Faith. That's the name of my blog. And you just search for my thesis there. I make it freely available for anybody who wants to see it. By the way, I do want to say one more thing about just about Sharia law and in specific Saudi Arabia. There still exists something called male guardianship for women. So typically women are the guardians of their guardians are either their father, and then when they get married, it transfers to their husband. So they really have to have their permission from their fathers or their husbands in order to do many things, whether it's get an education or now drive. Even though women have the right to drive now in Saudi Arabia, they really still have to have the permission from their guardian to do it. So we have seen some signs of increased freedom for women in Saudi Arabia, but it's very slow and incremental. and still you have to have the permission or release authority from either your husband or your father.
Mm-hmm. And I know there are nations that are influenced by Islam, but aren't as faithful to the Quran or the Hadith. And many Muslims would look at those as movements that have been influenced by Western values and are not even faithful Muslims. So these moderate Muslim nations, right? It is interesting to take these laws back to their original sources, to the Quran and the Hadith itself, and to see that they're still there. They're not just human wisdom, so to speak. If the Quran is the word of God, then these things are being translated directly into those laws. So what about Hinduism then? When we're looking at India, it is a bit different. You've got Islam dispersed a little bit more around the world, far more countries than just one or two or three or even 10. But for Hinduism, whereas you've got Hindus throughout the world, the majority of Hindus are still in India today. And it's a huge country. And they have a lot of Muslims there as well. And we know that there are cultural aspects that influence their laws too. But what are the maybe the main sources that influence laws in India that sort of get back to the Hindu origins?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, India, like Hinduism, like Islam, is a way of life.
Mm-hmm.
It influences the culture, the way you live. So it's not just a quote religion, but it is a way of life. But what's unique about India, for example, and I didn't know this until I started doing my research, they have 3 sets of family laws. What do I mean by that? There's a set of laws for Hindus, there's a set of laws for Muslims, and a set of laws for Christians when it comes to family law matters in India. They have 3 separate sets of laws. But India is an interesting experiment, if you will, because we see a very pluralistic society, not just in the people who live there, but it's even embodied in their laws. And so historically, we have seen coming out of that country, well, for example, there's been a major son preference in India, preferring men over women and valuing men over women. And we kind of see this, how it even played out in the caste system, which comes out of Hinduism and Hindu thought, where you have priority or values over people based on your designated caste. And that's something that you're born into. And of course, then there's the Dalits that are really kind of outside of the caste system, right? They're like the lowest of the lowest, the untouchables. So we can see even just in that inherent system that there is not an equal view of humanity, let alone men and women. Now, of course, officially, supposedly the caste system has been abolished, but quite honestly, in practice, it still exists. I've been to India a couple times, and I've met some Christians even who are Brahmins, and they're still very proud of being a Brahmin, which is,
they're born into the Brahmin caste, but they're a Christian by conviction.
Exactly.
And so you find some of that being confusing in their own lives?
Exactly, because if they use that to value themselves or esteem themselves as higher or more important than others because of their caste, then in practice it shows up in how you treat one another. And we're just not very good at treating people well. We're just selfish, all over the world. I think we're just selfish people. And unless we have something else that is driving us to think about others as just as important as ourselves, we're just going to be inherently selfish. And so the caste system lends itself to that. But there are all kinds of other issues that I raise in my thesis. For example,
if I could just interject real quick too, not just the caste, right, but also because of their pantheistic worldview, they don't see humans as necessarily a notch above, say, the animal kingdom. They have holy cows walking down the road everywhere, right, and they treat them very well.
That's right.
Probably much better than the Dalits that are the outsiders outside of the caste even.
Oh yeah, no, it's true. If you first time I went to Chennai, India, I saw cows just roaming the streets, and there are lots of them, and they have makeup on, and they have costumes and jewelry, and
they even give them the best makeup.
Anyway, yeah,
Okay.
it definitely is a difference in how you value what we in Christianity would say is that only humans were made imago Dei. We're created in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the animal kingdom is not created in the image of God. Therefore, we inherently have more value. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. But another example where we see just the treatment of women in the laws in India has to do with how, for example, they have various widow acts and trying to give some more value to the widows who have been traditionally very undervalued. So much that a woman who is widowed may throw herself on her husband's burning body to join him in the afterlife or the next life, if you will. And if not voluntarily, she may be pushed into. You've probably heard about the burning brides and the sati practice. So that's part of this devaluing a woman, that a woman finds value only in being married, that's what gives her some value. But even women who are brought into some families, whether it doesn't matter what caste you are, there's this, the mother-in-law may severely treat the daughter-in-law harshly, set serious restrictions. Maybe she's not even allowed to go out of the house. There's just a devaluing of women. So there's so many different ways that it plays out. Still, we see it in the dowry system, and women are just kind of like up for grabs, almost become like a commodity, bargaining for their how much they're worth, and that's just such a problem still in the Hindu. Well, it's not just child bride. It's not just a problem in India. It's also a problem in Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in terms of Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, for example, I would look at those more like inspiring books rather than inspired text. Whereas in the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, their scriptures are supposedly from a creator God, distinct from his creation. But in Hinduism, in Buddhism, a religion that's more pantheistic philosophically, that all is God, there's not a separation between creator and creation. There's a manifestation or a lot of manifestations, an incarnation or a lot of incarnations, avatars of the divine as well, right? So those texts, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Lotus Sutra in Buddhism, like you said, those establish a way of life, a way of behaving, and a way of valuing people. What about when we move on from Hinduism in India and look at some of those laws? What about China then? So this one is represented for us by the religion of atheism. First of all, tackle that. How is atheism a religion?
Yeah. So religion is really just a way of approaching life and explaining life. And even atheists, although they don't believe in a divine or the supernatural, have a worldview that tries to make sense of life. So they actually are a religion, maybe not in the sense that they have holy books like Christianity or Islam, but or believe in a divine, but certainly everybody worships something. So if you don't worship a god, you worship yourself, you worship your car, your career, money. I mean, we all worship something.
Yeah.
And more than likely, atheists are going to be worshiping in something material because they don't believe in the supernatural. It is a materialistic worldview. And so when I started my research to look for the country that would embody the most atheistic view, I was surprised to find that it was China. And then as I dug in and started studying more about the governing system there, and of course the laws, and the Chinese Communist Party, of course, rules China, and the Communist Party declares itself to be atheist, and that China is an atheist country. Now, that's not to say that everybody's atheist there, because that's not what I'm saying. There are people of many different faiths and religions who live there, including Christians, but nevertheless, the official worldview is atheism in China.
Yeah, and it should be noted, too, that religion is notoriously difficult to define, even by scholars of religion. When you think about the major religions of the world, you think Judaism, Islam, and Christianity in the West. In the East, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism. Buddhism, huge religion. A number of Buddhists in China, in Japan, in Southeast Asia. But Buddhism, in its first 500 years, Theravada Buddhism, is non-theistic. So if religion, by definition, entails belief in a supreme being, then Buddhism wouldn't be a religion, and we don't categorize it in that way. But we look at what has influenced China, as you point out. You do have some, a good number of Confucianists there. There are Muslims, there are Christians. But the law of the land follows Karl Marx. And it may be Maoist Marxism as opposed to Leninism or Western Marxism, Italian and German Marxism, but it's Marxism nonetheless. And that does have a certain view of humanity, doesn't it? I mean, it lacks something that puts humans on any greater scale than animals, in which case it's not as far from Hinduism. It might be farther away from Islam. It certainly doesn't, look at humans as the apple of God's eye by any means, right? So what about some of their laws relative to women then, if that's a representative example of a very secularist, atheistic governing society?
Yeah. Well, let me just back up for a second. One thing I wanted to add in terms of China's laws is they are heavily influenced by this atheism as a basic belief for the Communist Party that's in charge there. So, of course, the government that's in charge is going to be implementing the laws and the rules. So we have to understand that atheism and what even atheism means, because it is purely naturalistic. And if you're going to look for naturalistic explanations exclusively and put aside and reject any divine or supernatural, when it comes to humanity, we're stuck with kind of, this neo-Darwinism of survival of the fittest, right? That we are going to value in society then those that are the most powerful, those that are most able. So we're definitely going to be valuing those material things in terms of valuing humanity. So we can just see just the impact of having an atheistic worldview would have on the laws. Now, having said that, the other thing we need to know about communism in general, and specifically Chinese communism, which we have seen this to be, they're not necessarily forthright and open and honest, right? There is, we'll call it propaganda, putting forth images and messaging that help to further your own goals. So, for example, China is passing some laws. They have passed some laws that purport to give women some freedom and rights. Women have the right to marry. They both have the right to marry. They both have the right to divorce. They have the right to education. They have the right to work. But when you actually see how it's playing out and how it's lived out, women are still very devalued. There is a strong son preference still in China. Women are devalued. And because they had the birth limitation limit, although they're really trying to unwind from that, but they've had this birth limit where they could only have one child for a long time. Of course, that's, like I said, that's changing. But because they preferred sons, they would tend to abort the female babies, or worse yet, kill their female babies or abandon them. So we see, although the laws are appearing to give some value, equal value to women, what is actually happening when it's lived out in everyday life. And women who are divorced tend to be viewed with shame, whereas the men are not. And they have a tougher time recovering, especially economically, in terms of just getting jobs and taking care of their families. Usually the children are going to go with father if father wants the children. So when you actually take a look at the laws, even though they're purporting to have some freedoms, I believe that it kind of falls under this whole propaganda mindset that we're going to put forth to the world that we are giving equal value to women. But when you look at how it's lived out, we see something very different. And I cite to many sources, global resources that are very objective, U.S. State Department, where we can even get information, because mind you, we kind of question some of the information and reports and statistics that are actually coming out of China itself, if it's coming from the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that term equality. So Marx wanted to dedicate, I believe, his Das Kapital to Charles Darwin. And this is all about survival of the fittest, right? The strong survive. And so Darwin gave naturalism a view of human origins. Marx turns around and gives humans a telos, a goal. And that goal is some kind of utopia, some kind of equality, not just in terms of class, but maybe in terms of race, sex, class, gender, the whole thing, right? So you've got this notion of equality, but from whence does equality come? So there's a book out that I remember using in grad school one time, and it drew all kinds of ire from other students in the classroom. And it was called A Natural History of Rape, a biological case for sexual coercion, by two evolutionary biologists who essentially said, look, if naturalism's true, everything has to have a natural explanation, including rape. And so their thesis was that the strongest male in any population seeks to perpetrate as many females as possible in order to perpetuate its DNA. Perpetrate in order to perpetuate. Drew all kinds of ire from feminists, and they said, wait a minute, we're not saying that we endorse rape, we're just saying there's a natural explanation for it. By contrast, it's really hard-pressed for one to come up with a natural explanation for equality. Why ought we give women equal rights? Or why ought we give weak men equal rights? Or anything outside of the bounds of the strong that survive? So it seems that would have some impact on laws within a naturalistic milieu.
Yeah, and actually that's kind of at the end of each of my chapters, if you will, on each of the worldviews, I give an extraction. So it's just kind of summarizing. And then toward the end of my thesis, of course, I will conclude that Christianity is the only worldview that offers the best hope for women and equal treatment. Why? Because the biblical worldview, we use the Bible to help us understand what we view, who God is, who we are. And the scriptures tell us that we are created in the image of God. So this Imago Dei, creating man and woman, look all the way back at Genesis 1 and 2, before the fall in chapter 3, we see that man and woman were both created in the image of God, and they were given charge to rule the earth, to take dominion over and to rule over it. So we see from the very beginning that they were working together. They were laboring together. They had equal value to God. Mm-hmm. There was no favoritism. We didn't see a hierarchy. That doesn't happen until the fall. In chapter 3, we have the fall, and hierarchy is established, not only in the male-female relationship, but it will set up the hierarchy for what's to come. Part of just the fallen image, the fallen nature of humanity, and wanting to vie for control. So you want to know where the first oppressor group started? Just take a look at Genesis 3. Mm-hmm. That's where it all starts.
Yeah, okay, so you have this transcendent source of law that makes laws not arbitrary, not humanly arbitrary. You have them universal, because all people have this aspect that they're created in God's image, so that it's also intrinsic. It's endowed by our Creator, inalienable rights, universal in scope. So why has there been so much abuse then? I suppose you kind of mentioned that in America, even though women probably have more rights here than just about anywhere else. Still, there's been problems.
Yeah, we definitely have had problems. And so I look back at the founding of this country with open eyes. There's some very good things about the founding of our government. We really were established based on Christian values. And indeed, the Supreme Court even said we were a Christian nation at one point. And we see Christianity, at least Christian thought, permeating every branch of government at founding. So that was good. Was it equally applied to women? No. Was it equally applied, for example, to minorities and to blacks who became slaves? No. So we had an application problem. That's the way I look at it. We had an application problem. And eventually, it took time for us to start to realize we have some really good founding documents. We're not applying them correctly. And so gradually we started making progress. But why even do that? Why is that important? Well, the biblical worldview is the only worldview that helps us to make sense of why we ought to do that, why we should value everyone and treat them all as fellow created beings in the image of God, fellow image bearers, whether it's a slave or whether it's someone who's disabled or whether it's someone who doesn't have all their mental faculties available to them. Why do we value everyone? The Christian worldview, Imago Dei, really is the only one that answers that question. But yes, we still have a sin nature. Even Christians still have the sin nature. So we still have a war that goes on inside of us, right? Those of us that are believers, we have the Spirit of God, which is really trying to lead us in this process of sanctification to do right, to think right, of course, first, and then to do right. But we still have this sin nature that is pulling in us, that is inherently selfish. And so I think that is, and that's kind of what I concluded at the end of my paper. The problem is not that we need more laws. The problem isn't that even laws are the answer. The problem is how we're living out what we believe in a consistent way. And Christians have not always done human rights well. Let's be honest. We haven't always done women's rights well. We have to be honest. Christianity provides the hope. Jesus is the hope, not Christians, not men, right? Jesus alone is our hope. And that's what I argue at the end. And one quote that I have in my paper is, it's right after Jesus had kind of given his little sermon about communion, right? Drink my blood and eat my flesh. And people were like, what? And and one by one, people started leaving like, this is too weird for us. And Jesus turns around, he sees his disciples who were still there with him. And he's like, kind of like, why haven't you gone yet? You're still here. Why aren't you gone with everybody else? And the answer was, where else are we going to go? You have the words of life. And so even though we look around and there are hard teachings in the scripture, things we don't understand everything. And we look around and we see so much fallenness even in the church. Where else are we as women going to go? We need to go to Jesus because he has the words of life, and that's our hope.
Not going to find it in the Communist Manifesto, in the Vedas, or in the Quran. Christians may apply their sources inconsistently, the teachings of Jesus, for example, but the teachings of Jesus is where we go. We find that we're created in God's image. Well, so a cross-cultural analysis of women, religion, and the law. What's your website, Laurie, where they can take a look at that?
Well, John and I have a website, intelligentfaith.com. My blog is not connected yet to that, so you can just go to Blogspot and do Laurie Stewart, and you'll find me, Women of Intelligent Faith. I have my own separate blog there as well.
Okay. All right. Well, Thoughtful Christianity, Women, Religion, and Law, a comparative exploration with Laurie Stewart. Thanks for taking time with us.
Oh, thanks, Corey.